Hello and welcome to Car Dealer Live. I'm James Bagger, I'm the founder of Car Dealer magazine, and today I'm chatting to Richard Coates. He's a legal expert from Freeths, and we're going to be talking about the business interruption cases for the motor trade. Now, a little bit of a complicated one this, Richard, but one that's affecting a lot of dealers out there. Firstly, perhaps you can just give me a quick synopsis of what the problem was and why this has moved on.
Yeah, so what had happened was that most businesses have business interruption insurance cover, and some businesses have extended that to cover the COVID-19 pandemic. There was obviously an initial rush of claims made to insurers to cover dealers' losses for the period where they were forced to close by the government. And as a result of that, a lot of insurers had tried to withhold cover, saying that, relying on very narrow or vague exemptions within their policies. And that led to obviously a series of complaints to the FCA, which ultimately led to the FCA bringing proceedings against 8 insurers to ask the High Court for a ruling on the interpretation of those clauses and whether or not they were lawfully able to rely upon them.
So we ran that story this week after that FCA test case in the High Court. There'll be a lot of dealers out there thinking, right, this is all solved now, I'm going to get my money. Is that going to be the case?
If only it was that easy. I'd be out of a job for a start. But yeah. No, what it requires, unfortunately, is the judgment's 160 pages long. It's obviously a very technical area of law on interpretation of clauses. What is now necessary is that if you had an insurance policy that was covered, so if one of the 8 insurers is your insurer, the FCA guidance gives them 7 days to contact you to see whether or not they are now able to pay following the test case. If that isn't the case, and there are, the FCA think there might be 50 different insurers across the country with 700 different policy wordings, then we or lawyers instructed are going to have to go through quite carefully the wording to see how it interrelates to the judgment, to see what the position is. So I suspect this is going to be an ongoing battle for some time, where insurers obviously are keen not to pay out under policies where they don't necessarily have to do so.
Richard, without naming names, can you give me an example of what you've heard of has happened to some dealers and how it's affected their businesses?
Yeah, I think what has happened is that effectively there are 2 principal areas where the court was asked to look at quite carefully, and those were claims under the disease clauses and those under sort of the inability for people to access premises to work, to sell cars. Some of the insurers have sought to say, well, actually, if you were in an area where there wasn't an outbreak, then you weren't, that might not necessarily apply to you. So there's been a number of cases where people, as I say, have tried to claim for significant losses because they haven't been open, and the insurers have relied on these very vague wordings under, the geographical spread of the disease, whether or not it was a notifiable disease, when the trigger happened, because obviously there was a timeline for the closing down of the country, which sort of started in early March and finished at the end of March. And there's all sorts of different sort of arguments around when it should bite, if it took effect at the right time, whether the disease was a notifiable disease at the point at which somebody tried to make a claim. So there are a number of different facets to this, and there are a number of dealers that I know of, and I've taken instructions from and advised on through UHY Hacker Young, who we're working with on this to deal with the quantification of loss, to talk to them about the reaction so far. Now, we're hoping that as a result of this, people can go back to their insurers and there can be a new discussion in the light of the findings from the court. But an insurer's business model is not to pay out, so they're clearly going to do their best to avoid it if they can.
Surely that must be very difficult for the insurers when it was a national lockdown. I understand it when there's these local lockdowns, but actually those don't affect car dealers. But the national one, they were told to close showrooms by the government for a certain period of time. You would think, or a normal thinking person would think, that was pretty much cut and shut for these insurers, and they'd have to pay out.
Yeah, and I think that's, that is, that is the sort of starting point that most clients come to us with. We were forced to do this. Why doesn't the cover stretch? Now, of course, it all turns on whether or not the exclusion clauses in these contracts for insurance under the policies are valid. And that's what the court has been asked to look at. Now, the great advantage for most people with these policies is the judgment, in my view, is very favourable to policyholders as opposed to insurers. Now, as with any first instance decision like this, can be the subject of an appeal. All the parties, both the claimant and the defendant, have agreed that it should be an expedited appeal if appeals are considered necessary up to the Supreme Court. And so we've got to wait to see what happens. I suspect there may be some appeals. There's articles in the press saying this could cost insurers in excess of £100 million for losses that businesses have suffered, that have often taken out. It's a bolt-on policy to cover these sort of instances. So hopefully it'll move quite quickly and we'll have an end decision. But certainly for now, if you've got one of these policies and they've said no, it's definitely worth revisiting to see whether or not their position will change, with the court having looked at there's 21 specific policy wordings the court's considered.
And to clarify this, I mean, it's not standard business interruption insurance, is it? It's where these people these dealers have gone out and specifically taken out cover for pandemics,
Yeah.
and that cover for pandemics has then somehow, strangely, because the insurers are insurers, excluded the pandemic that is the coronavirus. Is that correct?
Yeah. So there's all sorts of funny things. So, I've heard cases, where the policy will say it says the bubonic plague, but the Covid-19 virus isn't the bubonic plague, so you're not covered. I've had all sorts of strange conversations with people around that. But these are specific non-damage clauses. So often business interruption insurance deals with flood, fire, things that which would ordinarily pop into your mind as being things that would stop a car dealer from trading. In this instance, this is purely around notifiable diseases such as this. So this is often a bolt-on additional level of cover that these dealers have taken out to protect them in this scenario.
And I mean, that's a pretty forward-thinking dealer, isn't it? Who's gone out there and taken out a policy to protect them from a pandemic, and for them then not to be able to get their money off the back of the coronavirus. I can see why there's a lot of dealers pretty annoyed with the insurers at the moment.
Yeah.
Now, I don't not wanting to put you on the spot, but what are their chances of winning these cases?
Well, as I said, the judgment at the moment, in our view, is very favourable to policyholders. We are confident that if we can't get an insurer, if we liaise with the client and we can't get an insurer to agree the claim, as it stands at the moment, we're confident that if we issued proceedings and it fell into one of the categories that the court has considered, and the policy wording is the same but from a different insurer, off the back of that, we'd be confident that there would be success for those individual clients or dealer groups more widely. But obviously, as I said earlier, this is all subject to a potential appeal. But on the face of it, there's some very clear guidance in the judgment. As I say, it's 160 pages long, so there's plenty of guidance out there for lawyers and clients to consider. But it certainly falls definitely on the side of the Financial Conduct Authority that succeeded in the case, who were for the policyholders.
And what sort of sums are we talking that some dealers are claiming over? I mean, are we talking tens of thousands of pounds, millions of pounds?
Yeah, I mean, it will vary massively depending on the size of the business. So the loss would effectively be what that business would have made but for the pandemic. So for some dealers, exceptionally profitable JLR Arch Concept type dealers that are making significant money, it could be huge. For smaller dealers trading in less valuable cars, it could be a lot less. But I suspect for most people, it's going to certainly be in the realms of the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of loss. And that's why it's critically important to engage now. The other thing that I should just point out is that most policies will contain a time limit for notification of a claim. So if you are looking at your policy, you should look very carefully about when you should make the claim to the insurer to trigger that clause, because if you haven't done so, the insurer will say, well, you haven't done it, so you're out of time. So it's really important that people have a really good look at these policies. One of the things that we're doing is we're reviewing with clients, and happy to look at anyone else's that wants to get in touch, but we're looking quite carefully at the policy wording against the judgment. And actually the majority of people who've contacted us so far actually have policies that fall outside of the 8 insurers whose policies were tested in the test case.
So when it comes to this, that money that they've missed out on in that 2-month period they're closed, is this effectively to put them back on where they should have been had this pandemic not happened?
Yes.
That's an incredible. So it's an incredibly important thing for them to win this. I can see why it's a desperate cause for them. So what would your advice be? I know that you've got together with UHY Hacker Young to look into these things. Am I right in thinking this is a kind of class action where you're going to be fighting on behalf of car dealers?
At the moment, it's difficult to say precisely how the action would be created. So one of the things that we're looking at is whether or not it's done as a group. So there's effectively a group of people who have a specific policy with a specific wording, and obviously or a type of policy with a specific type or types of wording. So you could ask the court to look at it in the round. What is becoming quite clear is that the dealers we've spoken to so far have quite varied policies. So it may be that some dealers will be having to pursue it individually. It may be that we are able to get some group actions together, and in those circumstances, we can look at different types of funding arrangements. We can, there's a lot of options out there for people to take. The first and most fundamental point is to get the policies reviewed quickly, so we can give advice on next steps.
If people want to get involved in this and take you up on that offer of help, how can they get in touch with you guys?
So the Freeths website, which is www.freeths.co.uk, and my contact details are on there. We have a specific dispute surgery email address set up, which I can provide with you for you to add on to the link to this interview. And we're offering a consultation initially, so we can look at the policy, and we will request some information from clients to give us a steer, and then we can advise them really about next steps and how to take it forward. But as I said, and there's plenty on LinkedIn out there, because obviously we're conscious that we all of us have to strike while the iron's hot, not least for the reasons we've talked about the notification period and the policies. So it's important that people, these are significant losses, and it's important people move quickly to take advantage of this decision.
It sounds like it's a fight worth fighting.
Yeah, it is definitely a fight worth fighting.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for bringing us up to speed with that today, and please keep me updated on how it goes, because we'll definitely be following this story as it develops. So thanks ever so much for giving up your time.
My pleasure.
I appreciate it. So thank you.
Thanks
ever so much to Richard there for giving up his time today. For more videos like this one, you can log on to cardealermagazine.co.uk and click on the live tab at the top of the page. Thanks ever so much for joining me. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.